So Michael Lynn, former solicitor and property developer, has been convicted, found guilty by a jury in the Circuit Criminal Court of the theft of 17.9 million euros. There was 21 charges against Lynn, accusing him of theft from various banking institutions arising from his property development activities and his activities as a solicitor. Of the 21 charges, the jury was unable to find or reach a verdict in 11 of them, but they did conclude and find that he was guilty of theft in 10 of the cases, and there was a total involved of 17.9 million euros that he stole from 6 banks. The modus operandi of Lynn basically was that he was raising not just one but multiple loans on individual properties, and you might have a situation where, for example, a property there in Howth, his own house in Howth, called, I think it was Black Lion, it was worth 5.5 million euros, but he raised a number of mortgages, a number of loans on the security of that property, and totaling 11 million euros. So property is worth 5 million euros. The banks have lent 11 million, and the banks claim obviously that they understood that they had the first and only security or charge on the property, and were not aware that Lynn was actually borrowing from a number of banks on the same property. Lynn is from County Mayo originally. He was struck off as a solicitor in 2008. He skipped the country when he was supposed to appear in the High Court to be examined about the irregularities in his accounting and so on, but he didn't show up in the High Court. I think he went to Portugal first. He made some arrangements then with the Garda Síochána to attend for interview, and then when he basically skipped then to Brazil. So he went to Brazil, and he spent, I think, 3.5 years in the Brazilian jail because he was arrested there on foot of an Irish application to extradite him from Brazil to Ireland to face the charges. He spent 3.5 years in the Brazilian prison. He has given graphic descriptions of the appalling conditions in the prison, and as it happens, he and his wife conceived 2 children during conjugal visits in the Brazilian prison. However, he was eventually extradited back. He was struck off as a solicitor in 2008, and then he was extradited back to Ireland to face these charges. The trial took place first in, I think, spring of 2022, and after a good number of days of the trial, the jury was unable to reach a verdict. And so the trial that finished there last week was the second bite of the cherry, was the second trial with a different jury, and they have found him guilty on 10 of the 21 charges. Interestingly, Lynn's defence all through was that he had special deals done with the banks. He had off-the-books deals done, and it was his argument, his position, his defence that the banks, or this was common practice at the time during the Celtic Tiger years. It was 2006, 2007, 2008. He was saying that was common practice then, and he had special deals done with the banks, in particular with Michael Fingleton of Irish Nationwide Building Society. The prosecution says that that is an absolute tissue of lies, and they brought in various witnesses from the various banks to refute that evidence and basically deny that there was any deals whatsoever. And the prosecution counsel made the point, the obvious point, quite frankly, that it was implausible that the banks would agree to that situation, because why would a bank agree to lend on a property if 3 or 4 other banks were already after lending on that property? It simply wouldn't make any sense, and obviously a bank has to be concerned with how they're going to get the money back, and if they were number 3 or number 4 or number 5 in a queue of banks secured on a particular property, it's not going to be much good to them if, for example, like the Howth property, the property is worth 5 million and there's 11 million owed. So the defence essentially was seen as, and described by counsel for the prosecution, as a tissue of lies, complete nonsense, and the jury obviously accepted that, at least in 10 of the 21 charges. So the court, Justice Martin Nolan, had to counsel the jury at the outset that no matter how they felt about the banks, no matter how they felt about how lax or how unprofessional the banks were during the Celtic Tiger years with their lending practices, that they needed to look at the evidence in a cold and dispassionate way and make their decision based on the evidence, and not on how they felt about the banks or what the banks may or may not have done. So Mr. Lynn has been remanded in custody now for until January. So he's remanded in custody. He's spending Christmas in time, obviously, in prison, and he'll be sentenced in January. He was struck off, as I say, as a solicitor in 2008, and he has fought this long-running extradition battle for a while, but he's back now. He has been convicted by a jury of his peers in the circuit court, and he, as I say, has been found to have been guilty of theft of 17.9 million euros from various lenders. And it'll be interesting to see what the judge decides to do in terms of sentencing. Interestingly, or incidentally, there was quite a lot of contradictory evidence during the trial between Lynn and some of his staff. There was a lady there called Liz Doyle, who was a legal executive, I think, and then there was a partner, or a solicitor rather, who may or may not have been a partner. I think Fiona Michael Lynn was her name. But it transpired in the evidence that was given and so on that there were signatures forged. There were signatures forged on undertakings, and there was signatures forged on accounts that were submitted to banks and so on Mr. Lynn's behalf and so on. So there was a lot of skullduggery. And just by way of background, the situation with the solicitor ordinarily, this situation couldn't happen now because, well, it's very, very doubtful it could happen now. I suppose at that time he was actually developing on his own account. So basically he was borrowing this money on the strength of Irish properties, and then he was developing property overseas. I think he had a development in Portugal. I think he may have had one elsewhere as well, perhaps Bulgaria or someplace. But the ordinary situation with a solicitor is they give an undertaking to a bank, they get the loan from the bank for the client, and they secure the bank's interest in the property, their charge, by registering it with Land Registry. So that's what the whole question of the undertakings, how the undertakings arise and come about, and the solicitor gives an undertaking to the various lenders or a lender in any particular situation. The undertaking has to be signed by a solicitor, and in this particular situation the evidence was that certain undertakings, or a lot of undertakings, were actually forged. The signatures were forged. So that's the story. Hope you find this video useful. If you do, I'd appreciate if you gave it the thumbs up down below, and you may be interested in subscribing to my YouTube channel. If you're watching this, or listening to this rather, on my podcast, the Irish Law and Small Business Podcast, which you can access on Spotify or iTunes or wherever, then I'd appreciate if you followed it or left a review.